A little reported addition to the Prime Minister's repeal of COVID restrictions yesterday in England was the message that the UK would be stepping up biosecurity to prevent lab leaks that could trigger a fresh pandemic. 2 years of gobbling up Chinese propaganda and labelling people who believed COVID to be man-made as conspiracy theorists, with perhaps most disgustingly even the WHO dancing to Beijing's tune, the tide is now turning, with growing consensus among eminent scientists that the virus could not have evolved zoonotically from a bat and a pangolin in a wet market. Lord Matt Ridley, who has sold over 1 million books and is a member of the Academy of Medical Sciences, has penned a seminal text with molecular biologist and cell engineering expert Alina Chan, looking in depth and under the microscope at COVID-19 to draw the conclusion that the pandemic stems from gain-of-function experiments in a laboratory in Wuhan. Well, I'm thrilled to say he joins me now. Lord Ridley, it really is an honour and a privilege to have you here. I mean, first of all, let's start with, before we get on to the details of the origins of COVID-19, how has it been over the last 2 years being basically called a conspiracist and a lunatic?
Well, to be fair, we don't say we think it definitely came from a lab. We say that's a strong possibility, and it looks more likely than that it came through the market. So we're still open to any possibility. But even saying that much has had us cancelled and hugely criticised for raising the possibility. And it's not just from the Chinese direction, although, of course, the Chinese authorities have been extremely critical of us. They've done some rather amusing things, like inventing a Swiss scientist who was critical of the lab leak theory. The Swiss embassy eventually said, hang on, this chap doesn't exist, and he disappeared again shortly afterwards. But apart from that, we've had many Western virologists saying, oh, look, please don't talk about this, and how dare you say it might have been a lab leak. Of course, we're open to both possibilities too. Well, that's all we're saying, is let's have a credible investigation. We know that it's a strong possibility that this began in an experiment in a laboratory. Let's investigate.
How difficult has it been to investigate, though, with redacted paperwork, things going missing, this sort of veil of silence that have been placed over the research community and even daring to assert that it could be a man-made virus? Well,
it has been extraordinary because, the normal sources you would rely on, you'd ring up scientists in China and say, what experiments were you doing, et cetera, et cetera. Got no response from any of that. We've sent, questions to scientists, even in the West. Peter Daszak was a close collaborator, an American-based scientist with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has refused to answer any of my questions or those of my co-author. So we've been, and frankly, the scientific establishment's been pretty useless. They've been saying that they don't know how it started and they're not going to investigate, essentially. And I said to the Royal Society, shouldn't you be having debates about this? And they said, no, we only debate scientific matters. Well, this is a scientific matter. So we've had to rely, therefore, because much of the mainstream media has not been much, with some honourable exceptions, have not been looking into this. So we've had to rely on some surprising sources. There's one or two rather brilliant open source analysts. These are people who just, they're not doing anything secret or illegal. They're just getting hold of logins that enable them to look at Chinese websites, digging out theses, digging out entries in genome databases, digging out reports of experiments, of grant applications, and piecing together what was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology over recent years, what experiments they were doing, what they resulted in, and whether or not they could be related to this virus. But, there's a database at that institute. It has 22,000 entries in it, all different, related to different pathogens, different viruses and bacteria. We've not been allowed to see it. It went offline in September 2019. The purpose of that database was to help the world prepare for the next pandemic. It was part of something called the Global Virome Project. Well, which pandemic are they waiting for? Why not produce it and share with us what information you've got and how that could be helpful?
So what have you identified about COVID-19 that leads you to the conclusion that it could well have come from a laboratory?
Well, the virus has a number of features that are unusual about it. For example, it contains an insertion called a furin cleavage site. That's not been found in any other SARS-like virus before. That that's something that's been inserted into other viruses before as part of experiments to make them easier to grow in laboratories. There was a proposal to do exactly that to a SARS-like virus in this laboratory. And when this virus sequence was identified, they failed to draw attention to this particular feature of it, which was a bit odd because it stands out like a sore thumb. As my co-author puts it, it's like a unicorn turning up and you describe the hooves and the mane, but not the horn. So there's that's an example of the sorts of things. But also, when they first identified the virus and they sequenced its genome, they said, we've got another virus that's very similar. It was found in Yunnan previously. This is its name. Well, I tried to track down where it was found, who found it, etc. Blank. I couldn't find anything about it. Turned out its name was brand new. They'd invented it the week before. They'd been calling it something else for the previous 7 years. It was in their freezer in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where they found it. But it was in the freezer because they'd gone to a mine shaft in Yunnan 7 years before where 6 people had got sick and 3 of them had died. And this was thought to be the first case of people directly catching a bat virus and dying from it. They'd brought those back to the lab and then they'd sequenced it in 2018 and then they'd been working on it since. And they said, no, we sequenced it yesterday. And then they said, that's the only virus we've got from there. Well, it turned out there were 8 others and so on. So these are the kinds of details we're having to piece together. Which sites they visited, which viruses they collected, what they did with them in the lab, which parts of the spike gene they swapped into other viruses and so on. It's an extraordinary detective story, really, and we're not at the end of it yet.
But thankfully, we have you on the case. Now, Benedict, I'm just going to quickly throw to you. I mean, do you smell cover-up here? And do you think that's because there are a lot of fingerprints when it comes to the Wuhan laboratory? It's not just China.
I mean, that's the difficulty, isn't it? Though very often the Chinese government, it does operate in secrecy, and not just the government itself, sort of all sorts of bodies in China are associated because that's just the culture that exists. I mean, there is also, a lot of people say, it's very unlikely, but it's not unprecedented that things do leak from laboratories, including very high security ones. I think smallpox has leaked, anthrax has accidentally been shipped from a lab before. These things happen more often than we like to admit. So actually, why would you rule that out, given that it does happen more often than anybody would want to be the case? And I do think that's just the thing, isn't it? It's the sort of the culture of omerta that exists in China and within parts of the scientific community. Makes you think, well, actually, why would they do that automatically? If it was all entirely, innocent. Now, I understand why. There's issues of national security in China that they have to sort of pay attention to. Every major country, they have programs when it comes to engineering viruses for safety purposes, for pandemic purposes, but also for military reasons. There's lots of reasons why. But nonetheless, I do agree that the fact that there just was, this complete sort of shutdown and all sorts of, different trails that one could have gone down, and so many sort of different competing theories does lend itself to the idea that it's entirely possible. And the fact that the global community did come out and go, absolutely not, you can't push this, it's racist, it's conspiratorial, all of these bad things, you can't talk about it. That, I think, just sort of sets off alarm bells in people's minds. They've seen too many things that have been labelled conspiracy in the past to then be proven true, to think, if the authorities say it's conspiracy theory, well, it must be then.
And Lord Ridley, very briefly, we haven't got long left on the programme. The publication of your book, do you think it's going to precipitate any broader international investigation, or do you think that's it? The international community are deaf to hearing about your findings?
No, we're hearing from a lot of scientists and from a lot of other people of relevance and expertise saying we need to follow up on this. We need to develop a way of protecting the world against the next pandemic, whether it comes from a terrorist organisation with a laboratory doing it deliberately, or whether it comes from an accidental release, or whether it comes through the market, frankly. We should be acting to tighten up the rules around research, but also the rules about the sale of wildlife in markets, because we don't at the moment know which of them did it, and so we ought to be doing both. So I do welcome Boris Johnson saying that both of those are on the table and Britain will be pushing them in a pandemic treaty. That's the way to go, to get talking to our allies about this.